Imagine that you are a Roman soldier, not a trembling recruit, but a man who has survived dozens of battles. You have killed in the choking dust of the battlefield. You have watched cities burn. You have heard the screams of dying empires. You have stood your ground against barbarian cavalry, against war elephants, against armies many times your size. You believe you understand war. You believe you have seen everything the world can throw at a man. And then on a sweltering morning off the coast of Sicily, that belief collapses. You stand on the deck of a massive warship, oak planks beneath your feet, your comrades all around you. Ahead, the stone walls of Syracuse rise from the sea. There are no battle cries, no rain of arrows, just silence. Then you look up. From the top of the wall, a single rope hangs down. Just a rope. No iron hook, no blade, no challenge. But the instant you recognize it, your chest tightens. Your hands begin to shake. Your shield slips from your grip and crashes to the deck. You start screaming, not a cry of attack, but the scream of a man who has just realized he is about to die. You turn and run, trampling your own brothers in your desperation to escape. And you are not alone. Hundreds do the same. An elite army, one that conquered the world through discipline and iron, collapses into blind panic because of a single rope swaying in the wind. If you're wondering why you're not alone, the Romans that day didn't understand either. They knew only one thing. That rope was not an accident. It was a signal. It meant he had seen them. And when he saw you, what came next was not a battle. It was an experiment. A cold, calculated experiment, where warships were lifted from the water, like toys where gravity itself became the enemy, and where the very idea of Roman power was crushed in front of the men who believed in it most. This is one of the rare moments in human history when an army was not defeated by gods, not defeated by numbers, and not defeated by luck. It was defeated by intelligence. Before we go any further, pause for a moment and ask yourself this: what truly terrifies an empire? Not a stronger enemy. Rome was used to that, not defeat. Rome was born from defeat. What made them tremble was facing something they could not understand, could not measure, could not stab with a sword or smash with a hammer. What frightened them was the moment the laws they believed they controlled suddenly turned against them. That year on the walls of Syracuse, Rome, faced an enemy like that. But to understand how a simple rope could break the minds of the hardest men of the ancient world, we need to step back, far back. We need to return to a moment when the Roman Republic, the greatest war machine humanity had yet created, was bleeding. A moment when Rome was no longer conquering, but struggling to survive. And we must go to a city that seemed almost irrelevant, a city of philosophers, merchants, and dreamers, where an old man, uninterested in power, was drawing circles in the sand, completely unaware that the entire world was about to crash against his door. If you think this is a story about secret weapons, be patient. If you think this is a story about genius, wait a little longer. Above all, this is a story about arrogance, about fear, and about the moment an empire realizes that its power has limits. And sometimes that limit is nothing more than a single rope hanging quietly in the sun. To understand why an empire could become obsessed with something as simple as a rope, we first have to look at the condition of that empire itself. Because in 213 BC, Rome was no longer a predator calmly stalking the Mediterranean. Rome was a wounded animal, and it was bleeding fast. Across the sea on the Italian peninsula, one name had become a whispered curse in Roman households: Hannibal Barca. Just a few years earlier at Cannae, he had inflicted a massacre so complete that military history was forced to rethink how defeat itself was described. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers died in a single day. The most powerful families lost their sons. Entire lineages that once dominated the Senate were suddenly erased. Rome did not just lose an army. Rome lost its most dangerous illusion, the belief that it could not be beaten. And when that illusion shattered, fear began to creep into the rooms where decisions were made. After Cannae, Rome was no longer fighting to expand. Rome was fighting not to starve. Fields in Italy lay in ruin. Allies turned away. Supply lines were severed. Each passing winter became a question of survival. Did the Republic still have enough grain to feed its armies? In that context, Roman strategy grew colder than ever before. There was no longer room for abstract honor, no longer room for symbolic expeditions. Every decision now revolved around a single calculation: where does the food come from? And when Roman senators bent over the map, their gaze stopped on one island: Sicily. If you look at Sicily, you quickly see that it is no ordinary island. It sits astride the most vital sea lanes of the Mediterranean. It is a natural harbor for fleets. But more importantly than all of that, Sicily is a massive grain field floating on water. Its volcanic soil was fertile enough to feed an empire. To Rome, Sicily was not a luxury objective. It was a bowl of food. Lose Sicily, and Rome would not just lose control of the sea. Rome would go hungry. And in hunger, no ideals survive. But Sicily was not an empty land. Its heart was Syracuse, a wealthy port city with massive walls, its own fleet, and most importantly, a long history of standing with Rome. For decades, Syracuse had been a loyal ally, a grain hub, a lifeline for the Republic. That is why when news reached Rome that Syracuse had changed sides, it was not received as a diplomatic development. It felt like a knife in the back. But this must be understood clearly. The Senate was not outraged by the betrayal of honor. They were outraged because a massive grain supply had just fallen into enemy hands. In wartime, morality is a luxury, and Syracuse had just become a luxury Rome could not allow to exist. The decision was not made after fiery speeches, but after cold calculations. Not calculations of glory, but of how many days of food remained. Syracuse had to be neutralized, not as punishment, but for survival. And when Rome needed someone to do that job, they did not go look for a diplomat. They looked for a tool, a weapon. That weapon was Marcus Claudius Marcellus. Marcellus was not a dreamer or a politician. He was Roman violence in its purest form. In a culture that treated war like a religious rite, Marcellus was a true believer. He had killed an enemy king in single combat, stripped the armor from the corpse while it was still warm, and earned the highest honor a Roman general could achieve. Marcellus was not known for mercy. He was known for results. To the Senate, Marcellus was the answer to a simple question: how do we make a problem disappear as quickly as possible? No one in Rome imagined the Sicilian campaign as a heroic adventure. It was an emergency surgery, and Marcellus was the scalpel. He was given authority, a fleet, and an order that required no interpretation: ensure that Sicily continues to feed Rome by any means necessary. When Marcellus prepared to sail, no one in the Senate believed they were sending him to face a genius. In their minds, Syracuse was just a rich Greek city protected by stone walls and philosophy lovers. Rome knew how to break walls. Rome knew how to starve cities. What they failed to anticipate was that this time their greatest enemy would not be a king or an army. It would be a mind, and in its desperation, Rome was about to throw the full weight of a starving empire against something its swords had never been designed to cut. While Rome was convulsing with hunger and fear to the south of the Mediterranean, there was a city that seemed to exist in a different reality. A place where war was something you heard about from far away, where decisions were not made amid the shouting of a senate, but in the quiet of sun-washed public squares. That city was Syracuse. For nearly half a century, Syracuse had been a rare exception in the ancient world. While kingdoms fell, as dominoes and alliances dissolved almost as quickly as they were formed, Syracuse endured, not by miracle, but because of one man. King Hiero II was not a great conqueror nor a legendary warrior. He was something far more dangerous in politics, a pragmatist. Hiero understood the limits of his city. He knew Syracuse was too rich to be left alone and too small to defend itself against the rising superpowers of the age. So he did not challenge Rome. He chose to survive alongside Rome. The alliance with the Roman Republic was not built on admiration, but on calculation. Syracuse provided grain harbors and stability in Sicily. In return, Rome offered something no wall could provide: deterrence. In a world where power was often measured in body counts, Hiero bought peace with food and loyalty. It was a cold arrangement, but it worked so well that it almost faded into the background. Years passed. War came and went elsewhere. Syracuse continued to prosper. Ships entered its harbor, not carrying soldiers, but cargo. Markets buzzed with merchants from across the Mediterranean. New statues rose. Theaters were expanded. Syracuse was not just wealthy. It was confident that it had discovered a formula for survival in a chaotic world. It was in this long, rare stretch of calm that something else began to flourish. Not military power, but intellect. Syracuse became a center of Greek thought, a place where poets, engineers, and philosophers could work without constantly glancing out the window to guess which army might arrive next. And among all those minds, there was one man who barely registered politically at all. He did not appear at diplomatic banquets. He did not whisper in the king's ear. He did not write speeches or lead factions. Most of the time, he did not even leave his quiet gardens. His name was Archimedes. To Syracuse at the time, Archimedes was not a strategic asset. He was a curiosity, an eccentric relative of the king, supported because Greek culture respected learning, not because anyone expected him to shape the city's fate. He was known for drawing strange figures in the sand, for forgetting to eat or sleep while chasing an idea, and for his near total indifference to the world of power around him. If you were a citizen of Syracuse in those years, you would not have looked at Archimedes and seen a weapon. You would have seen a scholar, an intellectual allowed to exist because the age was peaceful enough to tolerate people like him. And that more than anything else is the crucial detail. Because prolonged stability has a dangerous side effect. It makes people forget that stability is temporary. 50 years of peace under Hiero created a powerful illusion. The illusion that Syracuse had escaped the brutal rules of history. That through wisdom and compromise, the city had found a way to stand outside the cycle of empires. But history does not work that way. History does not reward permanent stability. It merely ignores certain places until it has a reason to touch them. And in Syracuse, extended safety had blurred a fundamental truth. An alliance with Rome was not an unbreakable shield. It was a contract. And every contract has an expiration clause. While Hiero lived, Syracuse was protected not only by walls, but by the personal authority of a king who had lived long enough to understand the world. As long as he sat on the throne outside, powers knew Syracuse belonged to the existing order. But time does not renew treaties, and when a pillar that had stood for half a century disappeared, the entire structure built upon it began to shake. The irony is that at the most dangerous moment in its history, Syracuse felt safest of all. It had strong walls, full granaries, 50 years of peace to lean on, and the belief that whatever chaos raged beyond its borders, the city remained an island of reason in a mad world. What they failed to see was that this very sense of safety was the clearest warning that disaster was approaching. Because cities do not collapse when they are weakest, they collapse when they believe they cannot fall. And in Syracuse, beneath the warm Sicilian sun, with theaters filled with laughter and scholars bent over their manuscripts, the wheel of history was turning quietly. One small push was all it would take for the entire illusion to shatter. No city collapses simply because its enemy is strong. More often, cities fall because a vacuum of power appears at the worst possible moment. In Syracuse, that moment arrived quietly without trumpets or ceremony in 215 BC when Hiero II died at the age of 90. This was not merely the death of a man. It was the disappearance of the stabilizing force that had kept the city balanced for half a century. With Hiero, Syracuse had a ruler who understood the world as it was not as people wished it to be. Without him, the city was forced to face that world, armed only with its own illusions. The throne passed to his grandson, Hieronymus, a boy of just 15. History offers few combinations more dangerous than youth absolute power and incomplete information. Hieronymus had no memory of the hard years before the alliance with Rome. He knew only a Syracuse that was rich, secure, and respected by the great powers. To him, peace was not the product of exhausting calculation. It was the natural state of things. Then the reports began to arrive. From the Italian peninsula came news of Roman defeats. Names like Trasimene and especially Cannae were no longer just battles. They became stories exaggerated with every retelling. Each messenger carried not only facts, but fear and distortion. In the corridors of Syracusan power, whispers spread that Rome was dying, that the Republic was old and exhausted, that Carthage's moment had come. To a teenager who had never witnessed Rome's rise, those whispers sounded reasonable. This is the point where history often turns down a road with no return. Hieronymus did not see the world through the eyes of someone who had lived long enough to watch empires rise and fall. He saw it as a short-term gamble. If Rome was about to collapse, why should Syracuse sink with it? If Carthage was winning, why not stand with the victor? In his mind, this decision was not a betrayal. It was an adaptation. But power rarely allows neutral choices. When Hieronymus chose to break the alliance with Rome and align Syracuse with Carthage, he did more than switch sides on paper. He triggered a chain reaction no young king could control. Syracuse, long held together by a fragile balance between pro-Roman and anti-Roman factions, immediately descended into purges. Those who supported the old alliance were removed not because they were dangerous, but because they represented the past. New power demands purity. And in the ancient world, political purity was often purchased with blood. Syracuse began hollowing itself out, eliminating the very people who best understood how Rome thought and how Rome responded. This did not come from calculated cruelty. It came from fear. A fragile regime always suspects that its greatest enemy is not beyond the walls, but inside them. Meanwhile, in Rome, the cold calculations continued. The Senate did not view Syracuse's actions through an emotional lens. They saw them as new data in a survival equation. A city that had once been an ally, that had once fed Rome, was now a potential enemy base. In wartime, neutrality does not exist. By its own choice, Syracuse redefined its position on the Roman map. From a strategic asset, it became a threat. The irony is that Hieronymus did not live long enough to see the consequences of his decision. His reign was so brief and chaotic that even his early supporters quickly turned against him. After barely more than a year on the throne, he was assassinated by those around him, but his death did not restore the old order. It left behind an even more dangerous vacuum. Into that vacuum stepped the Carthaginian faction, which rapidly seized full control of Syracuse. The gates were shut. The last channels of communication with Rome were cut, and in doing so, they transformed the city into something entirely different in Roman eyes. Syracuse was no longer a misguided partner that could be reclaimed through diplomacy. It became a legitimate target. There was no thunder, no supernatural warning. Only a sequence of very human choices linked together by cold logic. An old king died. A boy took the throne. Distorted reports were believed. An alliance was broken. Those who understood the enemy were removed. And on the far side of the Mediterranean, a starving empire recorded all of this as an unavoidable conclusion. History is often told as the story of great battles, but its most decisive moments usually happen in silence, in rooms where a young ruler believes he understands the world. Syracuse was not condemned at the moment Marcellus set sail. It signed its own sentence earlier, when long stability hardened into illusion, and a decision was made on the belief that time would never turn against it. When Syracuse placed itself in the position of an enemy, Rome's response was not emotional. There was no public outrage, no dramatic curses, only a cold shift in strategic priorities. A city that had once been a source of life was now an unacceptable risk, and risk in Roman thinking had to be eliminated. The man assigned to that task required no elaborate introduction in the corridors of Republican power. Marcus Claudius Marcellus was not a name spoken with affection, it was spoken with trust. Marcellus was the kind of man Rome used when it wanted a problem to disappear quickly and decisively. In a culture that treated war as a civic virtue, Marcellus was its purest embodiment. He had fought since his youth, campaigned across northern Italy, and proven again and again that he did not hesitate when action was required. Marcellus's reputation was not built on easy victories. It was forged in confrontations where Roman discipline was tested and confirmed. He was a general of the old school who believed in heavy infantry iron discipline and the idea that no wall was impregnable if you had enough time and enough steel. To the Senate, Marcellus was not an innovator. He was a guarantee, a man who would do what Rome had always done and do it effectively. His confidence was not blind arrogance. It was grounded in experience. Marcellus had seen Greek cities before. He understood their pattern: wealthy, saturated with art, defended by elegant walls, and with citizens more accustomed to debate than to sustained warfare. Those cities usually fell not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked endurance. To a Roman general, Syracuse did not look fundamentally different. It might be larger, richer, but at its core, it was still a Greek city. And Rome knew how to deal with cities like that. Marcellus was given command of a formidable force. On land, he led legions hardened by the Second Punic War soldiers, who had survived encounters with Hannibal himself. These were not fresh recruits. These were men who had learned how to endure the worst conditions imaginable. At sea, Marcellus commanded a powerful fleet, anchored by massive quinquiremes, the unmistakable symbols of Roman naval power. But Rome did not bring men alone. They brought engineering. To the Romans, war was a technical problem, to be solved with the right tools. Among those tools, none was more imposing than the sambuca. This was not a subtle weapon. It was Roman thinking made physical, direct, brutal, and efficient. A colossal wooden structure, wide enough for multiple soldiers to charge abreast, mounted on warships, and designed to slam directly against city walls from the sea. In previous campaigns, the sambuca had proven its worth. It allowed Roman forces to bypass walls without prolonging a siege. It turned fortifications from barriers into pathways. And to Marcellus, there was no reason to believe Syracuse would be an exception. Roman engineers had calculated angles, distances, and weights. Everything fell within familiar parameters. How Rome viewed Syracuse at this moment is crucial. They did not see a fortress of science. They did not see a city defended by intellect. They saw a storehouse of wealth and grain protected by stone walls and excessive confidence. In Roman eyes, Syracuse was not an equal opponent. It was a target, a siege problem that required time, not creativity. This produced a sense of near certainty throughout the campaign. Not the excitement of a new conquest, but the patience of a task nearing completion. Marcellus did not rush. He did not need to. Time favored Rome, or at least he believed it did. Syracuse could resist, but in the end, every city grew hungry. And when hunger came, every city opened its gates. When the Roman fleet appeared off the coast of Sicily and began its approach towards Syracuse, the mood in the camps was not fear. It was anticipation. The soldiers saw a campaign with clear rewards, victory, plunder, and another step forward in the Republic's fight for survival. To them, this was not a confrontation with genius. It was an assignment. Rome entered the Siege of Syracuse, convinced it was doing what it did best. It had the right commander, the right tools, and centuries of experience at its back. In Roman logic, there was no scenario in which Syracuse did not fall. The only remaining question was how long it would take, and it was precisely that certainty, that confidence built on a history of victory, that made the next moment unthinkable. Because when Rome knocked on the gates of Syracuse, it expected them to break. What it did not know was that behind those walls waited not the weakness of a Greek city, but an entirely different way of thinking about war. Up to this moment, everything was unfolding exactly as Rome expected. The fleet had arrived. The legions were in position. The walls of Syracuse stood clear beneath the Sicilian sun, high thick, but nothing the Romans had not seen before. In the logic of ancient warfare, this was the moment roles were assigned. One side attacked with force, the other defended with stone and resolve. But at Syracuse, those roles were about to be reversed. The man behind that reversal did not appear on the walls in armor, did not ride a horse, did not shout commands. He did not fit any Roman image of an enemy. He was an old man in his 70s, thin, withdrawn, and almost entirely indifferent to war. His name was Archimedes, and for the first time in history, a conflict between empires was about to be shaped by someone who had no interest in victory, as it was usually understood. For years, under the reign of Hiero II, Archimedes had been persuaded, almost harassed, into applying his abstract theories to the defense of the city, not because he wanted to protect Syracuse, but because he disliked being disturbed. If his machines could make the enemy go away, he could return to drawing circles in the sand. The motive was not noble, but the outcome was historic. When Marcellus ordered the fleet forward into the harbor, he expected the familiar chaos of a besieged city. Arrows are raining down. Stones were hurled from the walls, shouting. Instead, he encountered a troubling silence. Massive quinqueremes advanced in tight formation. The sambuci were raised ready to drop the bridges onto the battlements. Everything was precise, orderly, and confident. Then from behind the walls, Syracuse began to move. Huge wooden arms, previously hidden, slowly swung outward, like the limbs of some ancient creature waking from sleep. Hanging from the end of each arm were heavy iron hooks forged into the shape of talons. There were no victory cries, no threats, only cold mechanical motion. This was what later sources would call the claw of Archimedes. But in that moment, to the Romans on deck, it had no name. It was simply something profoundly wrong. The iron hooks dropped smashing through decks or locking onto the prows of ships. Before officers could even form the command to retreat, thick ropes snapped taut, and then gravity took over. Archimedes did not invent the lever. He simply understood it better than anyone else. A small force applied over a long arm could move an enormous weight. On the walls of Syracuse, that principle was scaled up to war. Inside the city, teams of men or beasts hauled on the ropes, using the wall itself as the fulcrum. Outside, Roman warships, weighing tens of tons, began to move. For the sailors, that moment shattered everything they thought they knew about the world. Decks tilted upward. Water spilled from the hulls. Soldiers slid helplessly, tumoring off the planks like dolls. The prows of the ships were hoisted clear of the sea, rising straight into the air. For a few terrible seconds, Rome's warships were no longer instruments of war. They were useless objects, suspended and powerless, before a physical law none of the men aboard could comprehend. Then came the drop. When the hooks were released, the ships fell from a lethal height. Hulls splintered, keels snapped, water rushed in. The sambuci, the pride of Roman engineering, were smashed to fragments. The harbor of Syracuse became a graveyard of wood and iron. But the greatest impact was not material, it was psychological. To the Roman navy, this did not feel like a military defeat. It felt like nature itself had turned against them. They were not beaten by superior tactics. They were beaten by the laws of the world refusing to behave as expected. And when people cannot explain a defeat, they begin to search for other explanations. The surviving ships pulled back, seeking what they believed was a safe distance. They assumed that beyond the reach of those giant arms, they would be secure. But Archimedes was not thinking along a single axis. As the sun climbed higher, something else began to happen on the walls. Blinding flashes of light reflected from the city. According to ancient sources, Archimedes had ordered bronze shields to be polished or arranged with reflective surfaces to concentrate sunlight. Did they truly set ships on fire? Modern scientists still argue about it, But in 212 BC, that question did not matter. What mattered was what the Romans experienced. After watching their ships lifted from the sea, like toys seeing sunlight bent and focused into searing glare, was more than enough. Sailors were blinded. Archers could not aim. And in a world where gods were believed to intervene directly in human affairs, the line between engineering and sorcery vanished almost instantly. A small fire, whether caused by heat or panic, was enough to complete the transformation. Fear spread faster than flame. Rumors exploded. Syracuse did not merely have machines. Syracuse had something else, something unnatural. And when an army begins to believe it is facing forces beyond its understanding, discipline collapses. Marcellus watched from his flagship, and for the first time in his career, he could not use past experience to make sense of the present. He had fought men, elephants, and fortresses. He had never fought geometry. Before him, the Roman fleet, the symbol of organized power, was being dismantled, not by superior strategy, but by an alien way of thinking. Rome was stopped, not because it lacked courage, not because it lacked manpower, but because it did not understand what it was losing to. And when humans confront something beyond their ability to comprehend, they do not call it science, they call it magic. In that moment on the waters of Syracuse, intelligence went to war, and an empire stepped back not because it was defeated, but because it was afraid. After the shock on the sea, Marcellus did what every seasoned Roman commander would do. He adapted. If Syracuse had turned the waters before the city into a death trap, then land still remained. In ancient warfare, walls could be neutralized by distance. Stone-throwing engines fired in high arcs. They had blind spots. If infantry charged fast enough and closed in close enough, they could slip into the safe zone directly beneath the walls. That principle had held true for centuries, and Marcellus believed that Syracuse, no matter how strange its mechanical tricks, could not change that rule. The order was given. The legions advanced from the landward side, moving toward the great gates. No fleet, no sambuke, just men with shields and spears, carrying the familiar belief that if they endured the first storm, the wall would break. The trumpets sounded. Roman formations tightened. They began to run. What they did not know was that Archimedes had never designed defenses in a linear way. He did not build a wall to stop men. He built a system to control space. To him, the battlefield was not a straight line from attacker to wall. It was a series of overlapping kill zones where every step forward had already been calculated. From a distance, the large catapults began to fire. Heavy stones arced through the air and slammed into the advancing ranks. This was what Rome expected. The initial losses, though brutal, were within acceptable limits. Officers shouted, urging the men forward. They knew that once they crossed this open ground, they would be safe. But as the distance closed, the familiar vanished. Instead of entering a quiet zone beneath the walls, the Roman legions walked straight into a new storm. From lower levels of the fortifications, smaller machines began to fire. These were not the massive, cumbersome catapults. These were weapons calibrated for short-range firing on low trajectories, fast and precise. Archimedes understood something many commanders ignored. Effective defense does not need to be strongest at one point. It needs to be continuous. When the heavy stones stopped falling, steel-tipped bolts began to appear. When formations spread out to avoid the rocks, they became perfect targets for direct fire. And then, when the Roman soldiers finally reached the base of the wall, the place they believed to be safest, they discovered that the walls of Syracuse were not bare stone. They had eyes, hundreds of small openings, carefully drilled through the masonry, just wide enough for an arrow or an iron bolt. From these slits, Scorpion's small ballistae fired straight into the crowd at point-blank range. The missiles seemed to emerge from the stone itself. No enemy exposed, no target to strike back at. Soldiers were cut down by an unthinking wall. Every Roman combat instinct failed. When shields were raised to block falling stones, bolts tore into their sides. When men crouched to avoid arrows, rocks crashed down. There was no safe posture, no blind spot. In that moment, the roles reversed completely. The Romans, long accustomed to being the hunters, became the prey. They were funneled into narrow spaces, forced to react instead of act. Officers shouted orders to retreat, then orders to advance, but every command was swallowed by chaos. This was no longer a siege. It was a hunt organized by a mind that understood every meter of ground ahead of them. Marcellus watched from a distance as the second assault disintegrated, just like the first, but this time there was no surprise, no obvious magic. Only the stark reality was that every principle he trusted had been rendered useless. Syracuse was not merely well defended, it was defended systematically. And that system had been built by a man who had never commanded an army. Ancient sources record that Marcellus, after witnessing the repeated failures, did not rage. He did not smash equipment. He did not punish engineers. Instead, he laughed, a dry laugh, one of recognition. He is said to have compared Archimedes to a hundred-handed giant from myth, a creature that used Rome's own tools to scoop water and fling it back at them. It was not praise. It was intellectual surrender. Marcellus, the sword of Rome, realized that he could not cut what stood before him. He could shatter formations. He could level cities, but he could not defeat a system built on laws that did not tire, did not fear, and did not make emotional mistakes. The decision was made quietly. No more direct assaults, no further experiments. Syracuse could not be taken by force, at least not in the way Rome had always done it. The killing wall had proven a cold truth. Archimedes was not merely a scientist forced into war. He had become a war maker, not with blades, but by designing a world in which every enemy advance led toward death. And when Rome pulled back, not from lack of courage, but from understanding that advancing further would only create more corpses, the war entered a different phase. Slower, less dramatic, but no less cruel. Because when Rome could not break the wall, it turned to what it did second best. It waited. When Rome stopped attacking, the war did not end. It simply changed shape. The machines fell silent. The walls no longer shook. In their place came waiting, long, heavy waiting, that eroded everything it touched. Syracuse had won its greatest battles, and that victory carried it into its most dangerous phase. Marcellus understood that he could not break Syracuse through direct violence, but Rome had never needed to win quickly to win. They had time, they had manpower, and they had a strategy as old as the Republic itself blockade. The legions built camps around the city. The fleet controlled the sea lanes. Syracuse was cut off from the world day by day like a breath being slowly squeezed away. Life inside the city did not collapse at once. The granaries still held grain. The walls still stood. And above all, Syracuse possessed something stronger than any storehouse belief. They believed themselves invulnerable. They had seen the Roman fleet shattered. They had watched the legions retreat in confusion. In the city's collective memory, Archimedes had become an invisible shield, a guarantee that whatever Rome attempted, it could not succeed. That belief spread quickly. It soothed fear. It transformed the blockade from a mortal threat into an inconvenience. People adapted. Markets remained open, though, with fewer goods. Debates still echoed through the squares. Syracuse began to behave as if time itself were on its side. They forgot that a blockade does not need spectacle to kill a city. It only needs patience. Outside the walls, the picture was entirely different. The Roman camps rotted under the Sicilian heat. Disease spread. Mosquitoes bred in the nearby marshes. Soldiers who had expected a short campaign now faced monotony and exhaustion. But Rome was accustomed to this. They did not panic when wars dragged on. They measured conflict in months, in years if necessary. For 2 years, two parallel worlds existed only a few hundred meters apart, one defined by growing complacency, the other by cold patience. And in that silence, Marcellus did what Archimedes had done before him. He observed. Not every wall is built at the same time on the same ground with the same care. Syracuse, with its long history, was a patchwork of architectural layers. Some sections were reinforced heavily, facing obvious threats. Others were neglected, not out of stupidity, but because they had never been tested. The opportunity emerged from a detail so small it was almost mundane. During negotiations over prisoners near a section of wall that received little attention, Roman engineers began to notice proportions: height, slope, the number of stone courses. They did not need to break the wall. They only needed to measure it. And from those measurements, a truth slowly revealed itself. One stretch of wall relying on treacherous terrain for protection was significantly lower than the rest. From a distance, it appeared impregnable. From the right angle, with ladders of the correct length, it could be climbed. It was a minor architectural flaw, concealed by decades of peace. And like all small mistakes in history, it only mattered when circumstances aligned. Marcellus did not act immediately. He waited, because attempting that wall in daylight would only awaken Archimedes' killing machine once more. What he needed was distraction, and Syracuse, in its confidence, provided it. The festival of Artemis approached. For days, the city would drink, sing, and honor the goddess. For a city under siege, a festival was more than a religious ritual. It was a pressure valve, a moment to forget the war lurking beyond the gates. That night, Syracuse did not sleep. Wine flowed. Music filled the streets. Guards who had stood watch for 2 uneventful years began to believe the danger had passed. They had Archimedes. They had the walls. And they had memories of Roman failure to lull them into comfort. Outside, in total darkness, there was no music, no wine, only muffled breathing and metal wrapped in cloth. Marcellus selected his best men soldiers, accustomed to climbing to silence to precision. They carried ladders measured exactly not a handspan longer than necessary. The first moment was the most dangerous, when the ladder touched the stone, when the weight of the first man settled. But there was no sound, no alarm. Syracuse was too busy dreaming to notice the nightmare had begun. One by one, shadows climbed the wall Rome had failed to break for 2 years. When the first soldier slipped over the parapet, he did not face alert defenders. He found guards, asleep, weapons set aside. There was no battle, only swift movements, clean final. The watchtowers fell from within. The gates, those Archimedes had defended with intellect, were opened by very human hands. When Roman trumpets sounded from inside Syracuse at dawn, the shock raced through the city faster than any machine ever could. No genius can protect a society from its own carelessness. Syracuse defeated Rome with intelligence. But in the end, it lost because it believed that intelligence alone was enough, even when vigilance faded. And in history, that is always the moment when tragedy finds a door already open. When the gates opened from the inside, Syracuse did not fall in a battle. It collapsed in a single moment of realization that everything was already over. Roman trumpets echoed through the city before dawn had fully broken. For the citizens waking in the haze of wine and last night's songs, the sound did not feel like a declaration of war. It felt like a sentence being carried out. Syracuse, the city that had challenged the Roman Republic with intellect, had been taken not by a machine, but by a very human mistake. What followed does not need to be romanticized. Under the laws of ancient warfare, a city that resisted a siege for so long was not entitled to mercy. The legions flooded the streets. Wealth was dragged from homes. Temples were stripped bare. Screams replaced the music of the night before. When Marcus Claudius Marcellus rode into Syracuse, ancient sources say he wept. Perhaps they were tears of victory. Perhaps they were the realization of the scale of what he was about to destroy. Whatever the reason, the wheel had begun to turn, and it did not stop for the feelings of a single man. Amid the chaos, there was one place that seemed to exist outside of time. In a quiet garden far from the main roads, an old man bent over the ground. He did not listen to the trumpets. He did not hear metal striking stone. Before him there was only sand and carefully drawn geometric lines. To him, a collapsing world mattered less than an unsolved problem. This was Archimedes. Marcellus had given a clear order. Archimedes was to be found and protected. The Roman general understood the value of the mind that had held him at bay for 2 years. He wanted Archimedes captured alive, perhaps to take him to Rome, perhaps simply to look into the eyes of the man who had forced him to change the way he fought a war. But in a city being looted, orders do not always reach the right person at the right moment. A Roman soldier, nameless, exhausted and on edge, entered the garden. He did not see a legend. He saw an old man refusing to obey. When the soldier ordered Archimedes to stand and come with him, the old man did not respond in the way power expects. He did not beg. He did not even look up. He waved his hand, his eyes fixed on the circles in the sand, and spoke a short sentence that would outlast every empire. "Do not disturb my circles." It was not a heroic declaration. It was complete indifference to violence, and that indifference killed him. In a flash of anger, the soldier drew his sword. There was no duel, no final words. One strike, and the man who had turned intellect into a weapon fell his blood, mixing with the sand, washing away the figures he had spent his life pursuing. When the news reached Marcellus, he was furious. He called the death a crime. He punished the soldier, ordered a funeral for Archimedes, and sought out his surviving relatives to protect them. But all of it carried a deep, tragic weight. Rome had conquered Syracuse, yet in a single meaningless moment, they had destroyed the one mind that made that victory extraordinary. Time passed. Syracuse became part of the Roman world. Archimedes' machines were dismantled, forgotten, or misunderstood. The people who had lived under the shield of his intellect returned to ordinary concerns. And then history did what it so often does with genius. It forgot. 137 years later, another Roman arrived in Sicily, not a general but a statesman and scholar. His name was Cicero. When Cicero asked the people of Syracuse about the tomb of Archimedes, he was met with shrugs. They did not know. Some even denied that such a man had ever existed. The person who had once saved their city for a time had vanished from collective memory. Cicero refused to accept that. He remembered a vague detail, a tomb marked with a sphere and a cylinder. He searched the overgrown graveyards beyond the city walls, cutting through weeds and thorns, and eventually he found it. A small hidden column carved with simple geometric shapes. That was all that remained of one of the greatest minds in history. The story of Syracuse is not a story about miraculous machines. It is a story about a deeper paradox. Intelligence can hold back an empire. It can humiliate power, but it cannot protect itself from the indifference and carelessness of the society it serves. Empires rise and fall. Cities flourish and are plundered. But the laws Archimedes understood still endure. The lever still works. The sphere remains perfect. And perhaps that is the final question the history of Syracuse leaves us with. When confronted with extraordinary intelligence, do we protect it, learn from it, or destroy it because we cannot understand it? Rome defeated Syracuse, but in some sense, it lost to the circles in the sand. And the question is this: if you had stood in that garden, what would you have done differently?